good question. Is it problematic to ask somebody, where are you from? Okay? So a California resident wrote to Dear Prudence saying that they hate this question because it opens her up to criticism about everything that's wrong with her state. Let's pull out a little bit from California. This question, where are you from? How do you feel about that?
Love.
You love it?
Love it. I love it. And that's why I ask people, when I sit in an Uber or I'm going somewhere, I always ask people where they're from. Now, in the past, I have to say, in the past couple of years, people have told me that maybe you shouldn't ask that question because they just say, well, I'm from Canada, of course, you know. But I think the great thing about this country is you can be Canadian and, right? We celebrate all of those. And when I'm asking the question, I'm asking because I care about you. I want to know where you came from, what's your story, what's your history. That's my job, really. But I actually do care about people and where they're from. And so when people ask me that question as well, I'm like, hey, this is really nice that you've taken the 2 minutes to care about what my story is.
Do you ask that of someone who looks like white?
No. No. Oh, do I ask the question of someone? I do.
Okay.
Yeah. I thought you were going to ask me if I only ask of people who are racialized. No, I really want to know because people, and from can mean I'm from British Columbia, but now I live in Ontario, right?
Sure.
It doesn't necessarily have to mean from a different country.
So does it matter who's asking the question?
Yeah.
And why?
I think intention is key. I think that if people come from a good place, it's great. I'll tell you a story. I was at a Costco buying chicken, okay? This lady comes up to me and she said, Omar, I saw the documentary you did with your mom, and it reminded me she was Irish, and it reminded me of my own family's story. Now, she clearly wasn't racialized, but she had a great story of immigration and how she got here to Canada. And so everybody has a story, and I think taking interest in that, but you have to follow their lead. Some people, if they don't want to talk about it, you defer to them, you respect that. It's a very individual thing. But the intention when I ask it, or my assumption when somebody else asks it, is that they're asking from a good place.
Okay, got it. Yep, fair.
I love that.
Fair.
I mean, I love that you're saying this because this is a question that I've kind of stopped asking because I've heard sort of the comments that it sounds like you heard as well. And as somebody who, I have one of those, I think, rare stories of like, I'm multi-generation Canadian, and yet I get asked that question all the time. And I love it when people ask me this. I always assume the best. Maybe it's because of the tone. Like if somebody asks, you know, like, where are you from? That's great. I think you're trying to connect with me. You're trying to place me. You're trying to know something about me. Maybe you think that I'm connected to you in some way. Whereas some people might hear the question, or some people might deliver the question being like, so where are you from?
As in you don't belong here.
Yeah. Right, and I think that's the difference. Like, what is your intention?
Tone is huge,
and anyway, I also recognize that comes from a place of privilege. I am white, you know, and so I can see why this gets very complicated.
Yeah, well, you know what? I'm like you. I don't mind being asked. I ask people all the time, and it comes from a place of I've traveled a lot, and I love connecting with people. So I'll meet someone, and I'll hear their last name. Like, I spent a lot of time in Greece, so now anytime I see somebody and I hear that last name, and I go, oh, kalispera, posiste, because I want to flex. And I'm like, hey, I speak a little bit of Greek. So it comes from a place that I want to connect with that person. I do feel like asking that question, you shouldn't be offended unless the person, again, is being rude, and you know the difference. But I love, especially living in Canada, where we are a mixed bag of nuts, we got a little bit of everything. I want to know, tell me about your country, tell me about your language. I want to go to that restaurant. What's the best restaurant to go to? Like, I want people to ask me that question. I also want people to feel comfortable to ask me that question.
Are we showing our city privilege right now? Because I think that the experiences in urban centers are probably more of what we all experience because we're so diverse in the cities. I grew up in a really small white town, and it was rural. And so I had immigrant parents. My mother is Asian. So somebody asking me in the streets, where are you from? And because I'm mixed, I hated that question growing up because it made me feel like I don't belong. And I heard that, at least that's how I took it. But when I would be out grocery shopping with my mom, and she's the only racialized person in the entire grocery store, and people would hear her Filipino accent, and then they would say, where were you born? I took that as a protective daughter. I took that very differently. Because what I heard was, you are not like the rest of us. And I'm not assuming that they were being racist. I'm just saying it made me feel like she was being othered.
Yeah.
And anybody who's racialized or comes from a minority group knows you have this forever foreigner syndrome.
Yeah.
You could have been born here for 2 or 3 generations, but because you're racialized, someone assumes you're not from here.
Yeah.
We have to also watch that.
But it's
So that's
also,
the caution.
it's also a chance to teach that person, because I have done that to other Black people where I'm like, where are you from? And they're like, Nova Scotia. And I was like, oh. And then I got a lesson on the history of Blacks in Nova Scotia. And I
Sure.
was like, if I didn't ask that question, I wouldn't know.
But I think your intention probably
My intention,
is good.
of course, is always good. But I will tell you something. When I go to the United States, I worked there for a while. I didn't want to tell anybody I was Canadian.
Why?
I don't know why. I didn't want to stick out. Anytime somebody asked, like, if they were going to ask me, I would just kind of be like, oh, you know, I'm from wherever. But it was a weird thing. I didn't want the Americans to know. I know. I got to talk to my therapist about that. I don't know what that's about.
Okay, we've all traveled.
Yeah.
Okay, speaking of which, we've all traveled. So what's the reaction when you travel and you say to somebody, I'm from Canada, or you have the little Canada flag on your backpack?
It depends.
Right?
It depends. You know, when you're in Europe, people will be like, oh my God, you guys are so nice. You're so kind. You know, I think in a lot of American cities, it's like, oh.
Oh, very much.
What? What do you mean?
Very patronizing, even a little bit. It's like, Canada.
The 51st state. It's almost like it's not a big deal,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
So I think it really depends on where you go. But by and large, positive.
Yeah, except for the time. Do you guys remember we had a particular mayor of the city who's no longer with us, and that was the only time that saying I was from Canada was met with like a, oh, you guys are now, what's happening? And that was so strange because I traveled obviously before that, and everybody was like, oh, you're Canadian, that's great. There are Black people there? And I'm like, yes, there are Black people. But then when we were in that time, that was the only time it was super uncomfortable.
Embarrassing.
Like, they were asking me like I was his friend, like I had to explain him, and I'm like, I don't know what to tell you. But yeah, that's the only time it was awkward.
I forgot about that time.
Yeah.
That's when I was like, where are you from? That place north of the border, maybe.
Hey there, what did you think? Drop your comments below and join the conversation. And don't forget to like and subscribe so you can find more on everything from food and fashion to pop culture and current events. See you soon.